So imagine Dean standing there on the set, putting up with this for a while, and finally Dean just has enough and just storms off the set. In other words, Jerry Lewis had just gone insane in terms of his power and ego, and he really thought he knew more than all these people, and he was just intolerable.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. We're doing a series now, a series in which we focus upon mistakes made in planning, a component of which is a stepmother. I started to say a step-parent, but specifically a stepmother and stepchildren. Now, by that I mean children who have a stepmother and a stepmother who have stepchildren, not the children of the stepmother. Does that make sense? Some may say, well, why aren't we talking about just step-parents in generally? Because, as we explained at the outset of this series, statistically, when you look at the cases in which there's conflict in probate, and I've talked to a number of our attorneys with Tucker Allen and with other estate planning attorneys, and there's even been articles written about this if you want to Google it. There's this phenomenon where notoriously, when there's conflict in probate court, when you have people arguing over stuff, what is amazing is the number of occasions, the percentage of the time that it involves this formula, an element of a stepmother and stepchildren. So that combination, more than stepdads, and part of this is a demographic phenomenon. We all know if you go in a nursing home today, just count the number of men versus women. And it's just a fact that when you get up in the years, you know, it's 5, 6, 7 to 1 women over men. And because of that phenomenon, I think you end up very commonly with, in these very plural families, these blended families that are so typical today, and they are probably the norm as opposed to the families of June and Ward Cleaver and the nuclear family as we defined it for hundreds of years perhaps. Now the norm is a blended family. And when you have that, and then you have the family getting older and aging, and one of the parents dying, typically it'll be a parent who is leaving behind their children and a stepmom. And so that is an invitation to conflict. So we've dedicated this series to that, to talking about this abundance of situations in which there was conflict as a result of that. And we'll talk about different ways of dealing with it over the course of this topic. We'll talk about ways that you can very strategically head off, sort of preempt these conflicts. In other ways, we'll talk about just mitigating them. Others trying to have methods by which you simply coerce peace by things such as it's called a non terrorem clause, a clause in which you say anybody who challenges this estate planning, there will be consequences, you lose your interest. So there's a variety of ways in which you can respond to this and anticipate it. But we think it's foolish to not anticipate the possibility if the composition of your family kind of complies with this sort of pattern that we've been describing. So we'll continue going through examples, some more difficult than others, and we'll also talk about situations in which it was handled very well, handled about as well as it could be, and one of those was Frank Sinatra in this series, but others where it wasn't handled so well. So again, continuing this series, we don't know exactly how long it'll go. Originally, we were thinking about a 3-part series, but there's so much material on this topic, and we think it's relevant to so many of you that we really want to continue covering it as long as we think we have good, useful information. So rather than have a fixed number at this stage of shows that we'll do in this series, we'll keep it floating, and you'll let us know the things that you like. If you want us to continue talking about this, if this is a topic of interest to you, definitely let us know. Whoops, here's Scout, my faithful guard dog. Anyway, so let us know what you think about this series. So today we're going to talk about somebody who, again, is from an earlier generation. So if you're under 30, you may not know this name, but I'd argue that if you're 40 or above, you certainly should know this name, and maybe if you're 30 and above. Anyway, go ahead, Marley, and introduce us to our topic.
Yeah, today we're going to talk about Jerry Lewis, the king of comedy. And, he was a very legendary entertainer. He was a humanitarian. He had well over 60 films, partnered with Dean Martin, and we'll talk about that some more. But they had a really famous comedy duo known as Martin and Lewis. Many notable films, mostly the Nutty Professor. And he also had his Jerry Lewis Telethon that raised money for the Muscular Dystrophy Association, which he was very well known for as well.
Okay, so Jerry Lewis died in 2017, right?
Yes.
So there were some issues with the estate, but we want to go back and kind of set the foundation, as is our custom on the show, to set the foundation for who he was. Even those who think you know Jerry pretty well, maybe there'll be a few facts in here that will be of interest to you. And then we'll talk about his death and the estate planning issues. So tell us about the early years and mid-years of Jerry Lewis's life and career.
Yeah, so he was born in 1926 in Newark, New Jersey, and it was to a Jewish family. He was Russian Jewish, and his parents were Danny Levitch, and he was actually a vaudevillain, and his mom was Rachel Levitch, and she was a pretty well-known, I don't want to say famous, a very well-known radio pianist.
So they were both performers.
Yes, they were both performers. He did not really perform in their shows or anything like that. They didn't really open up a lot of doors for him. But they kind of encouraged it as he got older, and he definitely paved a way for himself. He didn't really have a bunch of help from his parents, but I think he got the passion for it from them.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
Yeah, and probably the natural aptitude that certainly he had.
Yes, most definitely. And, he had a pretty normal childhood. They weren't really, wealthy. They weren't really poor, but they were performers. He watched them do that. But in his teenage years, he kind of got into a lot of pranks and he got into a lot of trouble. And he was actually expelled from his first high school in the 9th grade. And then he transferred over to Irvington High School, where he actually dropped out in the 10th grade because he wanted to, try to go big and take his act elsewhere. And by age 15, he had developed his first act, which was the record act. And it was him miming to a phonograph and just the lyrics of the songs.
So that does seem like not a very promising idea for a routine where you essentially mime in front of or play records in the background, you get in front of an audience and you sort of mime the lyrics. But those of you who've seen Jerry Lewis perform can imagine that it probably wasn't a boring sort of thing. So the way he did it, it probably was interesting because he went on. It wasn't just something he did in high school. He dropped out of high school, as you were describing, but I think that may have been the routine that he was doing in Manhattan when he met Dean Martin, I believe.
I believe it was because he went and he got his first act at a burlesque show, and that's kind of where it fell flat on his face. And he just kind of gave up at that point, and he worked as a soda jerk at a theater and a theater usher. And then he met somebody named Max Coleman, who was a veteran burlesque comedian. And Max somehow saw him do the act somewhere, and he persuaded him to try it again. And he did. And then it kind of took off from there. So I think he just needed a little bit more of a push and to really be into it and to really be enthusiastic about it. And that may have not happened the first time around.
Yeah, so apparently that sort of skit had some legs on it, and I'm sure that Jerry Lewis made it funny. So then he's in Manhattan, and he has a friend who introduces him to Dean Martin. And
Yes.
this was in 45 or 46, right? 45,
Yep.
I guess.
Yep. And they met and they honestly just like hit it off. And they were like, we need to get together. We need to do an act together. And, they did. And it just really blew up from there. They did like all sorts of like ad-libbed routines, which is what really set them apart from everybody. And they were, the Martin and Lewis show, and everybody loved them. They did all kinds of things. And then they ended up having a radio program and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's quite a story how they got started, and it was very original. So you can see why this duo became superstars for about a 10-year period of time, from say 46 to 56. These guys were, they were just superstars. If you can imagine comedians being that large, they were certainly the biggest comedians in America, and among the biggest comedians of the 20th century in terms of sheer popularity during that period of time. Those of us who are younger can think, well, Steve Martin, he was really big and cool for a long time, and Richard Pryor. But I'm telling you, at this time, there was probably nobody that was more dominant in comedy than these two. When they performed at halls, the largest in each city, they would just always sell out. And it was original. The idea that you could have somebody who would be on stage singing, a very good singer, incidentally, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin. Dean Martin was such a great singer. So you have a singer, and then you have this guy who could be anywhere in the audience. He could start out sitting in a balcony seat. And the audience had no idea what to expect during these shows. And it was just wild. And whenever they played a lot of the large venues like in Manhattan and other places, they would do 4 shows a night. That wasn't unusual to do a number of shows and have an afternoon show. So they may have cranked out as many as 5 shows a day. And again, that wasn't unusual for performers at that time. But when you're really popular, you're asked to do more shows. And I think that was really draining on them. They were going at 100 miles an hour at that point in their lives, and seeing success come so fast and so furious in terms of the variety of ways and the impact on their lives. I think people who work their way up to success very slowly, Marley, I don't know that anybody's written about this, but it's one thing to work very hard for a long time, a lot of years. You slave away, whether you're a writer, whether you're a performer, and finally you get discovered. I'm willing to bet that if somebody did a study of that and followed the success of these two groups, I would bet that the burnout rate or the self-destruction or blow-up rate is much lower, or at least later, than this situation where people are just, they come out of the chute, and whether it's luck or talent, and usually it's a little bit of both, they become hugely successful, and often they don't manage it well. And you just see that over and over and over. You see it with rock groups too. It happened to them often in that sort of instant success way. So anyway, they had that. They got together, and I think originally they met in 45, and so by 46 they had become well known, or in 46 they became well known, and were just such a knockout crowd. But their performance, I wish there were more of those taped. I've seen segments of some of these performances taped live, and it's something else. Jerry Lewis, you could not predict what he was going to do. He was a wild man. He was completely uninhibited. He wasn't constrained by any barriers of shame or embarrassment or etiquette or what's not. He would do anything, and the audience knew that. And it was, part of it was not knowing what to expect when you went to a show. And you talk about the perfect straight guy was Dean Martin. Here he is, this really nice looking guy. He's a man's man in every sense of the word. He's Mr. Cool, and believe me, for his era, he was Mr. Cool even more than Frank Sinatra. When you think of the Rat Pack, and they had this certain following and this certain cachet, and they represented this at the time popular form of masculinity, not so much in the 21st century, but at the time. Dean Martin was, he was the coolest guy. Now, Frank Sinatra fans, some may dispute that, but so here you have Dean Martin on the stage, and he's this cool, reserved guy. Then you have this monkeyish, crazy guy who has this juvenile way about him. He was only, 17 or 19?
He was 19 when they met, so he was very young.
Yeah. So he enjoyed success way sooner than he should have probably. Dean, I think, handled it much better. So Dean was older, and Dean was the big brother of the two. And Dean was clearly the dominant of the two. But I think as they became successful, that relationship started to change. Not in Dean's mind, but I think Jerry started thinking, taking more control, being more dominant, and maybe we'll ease more into that discussion. So pick us up with they've become well known. They soon end up with a contract and invitation to Hollywood.
Yes. So in 1950, they signed with NBC to actually be the host weekly rotating host of the Colgate Comedy Hour. And then kind of from there, they went on in 1951 with an appearance at the Paramount Theater in New York, and they loved them. And then that's when they began their film careers at Paramount Pictures. And then they were kind of ensemble players in My Friend Irma, and then the sequel to that movie. And then they starred in 14 different movies after that, which just kind of pushed them above and beyond what they ever thought could be possible.
And what is interesting about the Hollywood era, and I've read a couple of sources about their history. One I think was written by Dean Martin's daughter, don't remember which one or her name, and then another book that was written by Jerry Lewis called Dean and Me, a love story. I think that Jerry Lewis was pretty frank in that. You always wonder when you have the surviving member of a duo who writes a book and describes their relationship and his contributions to it. You always tend to be a little skeptical. But I think that Jerry Lewis was pretty fair in it, and he, for example, he was very self-effacing in describing the events relating to their launch of their career as actors, and that was that they were invited to do a movie. This was by 1950. They were invited to Hollywood and also doing a movie as part of this, or 51, as you were saying, Marley. And it turns out at the screen test, not surprisingly, Dean Martin was fine. He came off as Mr. Cool behind camera, natural, charismatic, that smile of his. So he was a natural for camera. He probably wouldn't be an Academy Award winner, although he did do some dramatic roles over the years for which he got nominations. But in my opinion, he wasn't the quality of actor that I think Frank Sinatra could easily have been known as a great actor if he had focused on acting and never done his music career. But Dean Martin definitely was a very good actor. I'll at least say that. He was a natural actor. No training. He just goes on the camera and he does himself, and he's good. It turns out that Jerry's screen test didn't go very well. And as a matter of fact, the Hollywood execs told Dean that they would take him but not Jerry to make a movie. And Jerry was, of course, shocked and stunned, and I'm sure that he freaked out at the idea that he wouldn't be able to be an actor, because if you think about the one who was just ruthlessly ambitious at the time between the two, I don't think there's any question, and I definitely think Dean Martin would be first to amen the fact that it was Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was driven by ambition, and he was a workaholic. I mean, he really did contribute greatly to the group. And Dean always appeared like he wasn't working, and everything in his life appeared easy. So I'm sure it wasn't always that easy, and I'm sure he was working. But the point is, you didn't get that impact. I mean, Dean would have been okay with the world if he hadn't been the number one comic in the world, or a famous actor, or acclaimed in any big way. Whereas Jerry was just consumed by this idea of success. So I think it is fair to say that Jerry probably drove much of the success of the two early on. And then all of a sudden he's in Hollywood and he finds out that they think that he can't act. What he did was he had an idea. Jerry did. And Jerry went to the studio and said, look, let's rewrite this script of this movie that you had in mind. Let's rewrite the script and have me playing what I am, the person I do naturally, which is what we saw later in movies like The Disorderly, Orderly, or I think that's what it was called. There were a number of movies he was in that were just kind of silly movies where he played kind of the same part he did in the comedian act. So he had them redraft the script so that he could play a role that was natural to him, which is what he did in the movies. And furthermore, let me say this in defense of Dean. Dean apparently told the studio that it's either both of us or neither of us. So Dean could be very loyal as long as you didn't disappoint him or offend him, his honor. There are things Dean, is a sort of guy that you can't do certain things, but as long as he regards you as honorable and respectful, then he's going to be true and loyal. That was his nature. And so the studio does rewrite it, probably in part because of Dean's threat. And it turns out that when they go back and do it, that not surprisingly, it's a success. It's very funny. So now we see the movies that came. How many movies did they do?
There was 14 together.
14 of them together. I didn't know there were that many. So some of you surely have seen some of these movies, and maybe some of you have seen all of the movies. They're not great movies, but they're fun and they're funny, and the acting's not bad. Some of the writing is bad, but the acting's not bad. And you can see how Jerry could do great in that role, and he did. So they went on to huge success. All their movies made money. They didn't. The movies that the two of them did together, they never lost money, and you can see why. They're fun if you go to them and watch them. I want to fill in with some of your information more, Marley, but let me add here before we return to your picking up what was going on in their lives later. One thing that became clear is that Jerry has this uncontrollable, this irresistible impulse to control. So if you've watched even like the Jerry Lewis Telethon, you can see this in his nature. And he was very dominant. And in fairness, those of us who think, well, we wouldn't behave in childish, demanding, egotistical, embarrassingly egotistical ways, think about your youth, and I think we can all think of circumstances where we did that. But imagine where in a few years you've gone from this teenager to somebody who is only like 22 years old, and suddenly you have Hollywood execs and you're famous and everyone's telling you how great you are, and now you have people around Hollywood that are running to fetch for you whatever you want, and you're getting all this acclaim and praise. So very quickly, Jerry starts becoming just so egotistical and controlling that even if you read Jerry's description in his book about his and Dean's career, you can see how bad it was, and that's Jerry describing it. And you suspect Jerry probably made it more gentle than it would otherwise have been. So I think that Dean just finally, if you imagine living with somebody who's controlling everything and ordering people around on the set, telling directors that he's not going to do this and slowing up scenes because he wants to control the scene. Here this guy is, this kid, and he's telling these people how to do the movie. And Now contrast that with what we know about Dean Martin and put these two together. So imagine Dean standing there on the set, putting up with this for a while, and finally Dean just has enough and just storms off the set. In other words, Jerry Lewis had just gone insane in terms of his power and ego, and he really thought he knew more than all these people, and he was just intolerable. And he didn't use the word intolerable, but if you read the book, his book, not to mention the book by those who were writing primarily from Dean's perspective, they all agree that Jerry was just unmanageable and uncontrollable. And again, before we're too harsh with that, some of us might have done the same thing in the same circumstances, but we'd like to think we grew out of it. And Dean continued to Dean's the sort of person that will take a lot. He's one of those guys who we've all known them. They're silent. They just walk off. They don't say anything. They take and take and take. And finally, there's this explosion. And when the explosion happens, there's no fixing it. So we know those people. Well, Dean's one of those guys. And when he came to the point with Jerry, he had put up with a lot of things over and over. And finally, there was some event that Jerry had scheduled without telling him. And it was just the last straw. And that was when Dean just told him, I want out. This is over. And so here they are. They'd been together 10 years, had incredible success. They're both still young men, and now they're going to each go their separate way. So Marley, pick up from there.
Yeah, and they never really talked much about like what exactly happened, and they said, they would never consider a reunion or anything like that, but they were seen like in the public eye a couple times, like after that and in a few years after that as well, but nothing like, a reunion or anything. But from there, Lewis and his wife, Patty, at that time, they actually took a vacation to Las Vegas when all of that went down because he wanted to like consider the direction of his career. And he was kind of in like a crisis state. He was like, I don't know if I can do this on my own. I don't know if I am able to do this on my own. I've always had Dean alongside with me. And while they were there, actually, he received like an urgent request from his friend Sid Luft, who was Judy Garland's husband and actually her manager as well. And he was saying, hey, she can't perform on stage tonight because she has strep throat. Can you please fill in for me? And, Jerry was kind of iffy. He was like, I haven't really done anything alone since I was like 5, and they wanted him to sing. And he was like, okay, I guess I'll do it because like you guys are my friends. So he goes and he like does some jokes with the audience and he's doing really well. And then he starts singing for the audience, and he sings, I believe it was a rendition of like a song he knew in his childhood. And it was like Rockabye Baby, I believe, or Rockabye Your Baby. And Judy Garland was like off stage and she was watching. And once it was all done, she came up to him and was like, we need to record this. Like, you're an amazing singer and we need to like put this out there. And so Jerry was like filled with, just like renewal. He was like, I can do this by myself. And from there, he kind of started a singing career. He actually charted like in the top 10s. And then he charted like number 3 on the billboards for that Rockabye Baby single. And then he published a few more albums, but he wasn't, like super famous from that. But he went from comedian and filmmaker and actor to singer-songwriter, which I found really interesting.
So we're going to stop here, as we often do, and this will end up being a part 1 and part 2 of this show. This will conclude part 1, so be sure and join us next time for part 2. This has been an episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.